Okay. Okay. So I am actually honored and like humbled to be here speaking to this group about this topic because I know that so many of you know so much more about this than I do. You know, I'm not a local. I'm not a historian. I'm an archaeologist, but you know, it's all intertwined. And as a cultural resources manager, you know, the job is to, you know, protect all history, you know, and even the very recent. But so the way I'm viewing this, what I'd like to see this as, you know, is more of like a conversation, you know, as a historic society, you know, we all have information to give. I'm going to put some stuff out there, probably going to be wrong or inaccurate, or I'm sure you have a lot more information. So I'd love to like have that conversation after this talk, and hopefully the slides and the pretty pictures I show, you know, might, you know, inspire or, you know, you intrigue people to just jump in and make a comment. Um, Being an employee of the Department of the Army, I am required to say that the views that I am expressing right now are those of my own and not of Fort Hunter Liggett, the U.S. Army Department of Defense. And all errors are absolutely mine. And there's going to be a bunch of them. So with that, let's get going. So the title of this, I put it as The Hearst Ranching Legacy, and it reflections on the landscape in Monterey County. And the reason I titled that, and I hope nobody's disappointed that I'm not going to be really talking about the Hearst Castle at all, and I'm not even going to get into the ranching, the cattle operations itself. I'm going to talk more about the effects on the landscape in the valley and what we see. And as an archaeologist, that's something we do. We look at settlement patterns and human behavior and how things change or don't change, which is really interesting. And I think you'll see that in here. And I want to start out by saying that this book, if you can all see it, Vicki Kastner's book on the Hearst ranching, Hearst Ranch Family Land and Legacy is a fabulous book. A lot of my information about the ranching era comes from this. And Steve Hearst's forward in here is really fabulous with the information they have. And then obviously Sue Raycraft and Ann Bennett's book on the San Antonio Valley is a lot in there. And then we've got a lot of the information. Are you guys able to see this? I don't know if you're not. Ava Taylor, the wife of Harry Taylor, the ranch manager for Hearst at the Hacienda at Fort Hunter Liggett, she wrote some memoirs. So there's a lot of good information out there that I'm drawing off of, and I'm sure you guys have a lot more. So I'll be focusing on more of the landscape and what I know, which is the landscape of Fort Hunter Liggett and the Haciendas. So we're going to be kind of diving a little more in that direction and not so much on San Simeon and the castle itself, but we'll get there. And okay, so I like to always start with the map. So if you guys can see, the outline there is Fort Hunter Liggett. You've got the Hacienda up on the north here, Mission San Antonio, and then the Hearst Castle and, you know, San Simeon, the coast right there. So this is the broad area, you know, when you look at the landscape and the ranching legacy, you know, we're really looking at here, you know, up to 250,000 acres that the Hearst family owned at its height in the 20s. So a lot of this is stuff that I'm sure everybody is already aware of. George Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's father, bought property near San Simeon in 1865. That's kind of where the story starts, you know, and the family would vacation there. George Hearst was a farmer from Missouri. He ended up going to mining school in Missouri and turning out, you know, realizing that he was really good at finding finding gold and silver. And he moved out to California during the gold rush, ended up being one of the first discoverers of the Comstock lode of silver in Nevada, and that's where he made his riches. He got married, had William Randolph Hearst, had a home in San Francisco, you know, where his mother and William lived while George Hearst was out working the mines all the time. So, the stories are that William and his mother would go to Europe. That's where William Randolph Hearst got his love of art and architecture. So there's a lot that if you go to the Hearst Castle tour, you'll see about that. But they would with this property in San Simeon Bay, George Hearst, had bought this little property, and they would go and they would camp, and they would hang out. And that's where, WR's love of this part of the coast started. And this is an image from Vicki Kastner's. Okay, so I'll go back. So after, just kind of a summary up front, after George Hearst died in 1891, Phoebe began purchasing up some property around San Simeon, and then eventually WR started buying a whole lot of land that I think we're all aware of. At its height in the 20s, it was approximately 250,000 acres. And today, the Hearst property is 82,000, and the castle's owned by state parks. And we know that, I think it was 2000. It was recently that the Hearst Corporation did the conservation agreement on the coast. So there's a lot of land that's still publicly owned, including Fort Hunter Liggett, which I'll get into a little later. But here's where it started. This is 1917 San Simeon. You could see, they had a cabin and some tents. And this is where young, WR would come in and camp. And this is the place, he ended up loving. They ended up building a pier. Once he started buying property and decided to build a castle, they had built the pier to bring in supplies. So we're starting to talk about effects on the landscape and the transformation from this to what we end up seeing as the castle. I want to jump to this slide. So actually, step back. We know this is, indigenous land, Salinan Indians, Chumash, to the south in San Luis Obispo County. The Spaniards come in and establish the mission. So you have these large missions. You have Mission San Antonio in this area, and Mission San Miguel, and you have this precedent of large landholding agencies that kind of starts. I mean, you could say, with the Salinan, and then then the Spaniards come in and they control this large area of mission land, and there's 12,000, head of cattle and horses and sheep, and thousands of people working. And then you get to the post-secularization, you get to the Mexican period, and they divide up the Spanish lands into these. This is a map of foreign land grants. There was another one, I think it was called Piedra Blanca. I'm not sure on that. But this comes back into play when Hearst comes in to buy up the property. So you see these 4 Mexican land grants here. Large landholding agencies that are now owned by different people up until 1848. But then they turn over into these other large cattle companies, like the Newhall Cattle Company, which Hearst ended up coming in and purchasing. So when Hearst starts purchasing all of this property, so it's like 1919, I think is, I'm trying to remember, I think that's when his mother passed away. And then he starts buying a bunch of property. He had already started purchasing property up north. So he starts buying up all of these land grants, including all the small homesteads, and the large corporations. And I know that there's people in the community. I mean, his real estate people were, known to be shrewd and, hardcore, and they were able to get whatever he wanted. There were very few independent local ranches that were able to hold out and not be bought out. I think there's a quote, I think Sue in your book, from Ramona Sutphin about how she tried to offer to like ridiculous amount of money and they bought it or something. So, I mean, he ends up buying all that property, and including the large, at that point, you had these large cattle companies, and he just purchased them outright. Then he begins to build up, where that little tent was. He starts to build the castle. He he already was working with Julia Morgan on other property, as we know that she was, received a degree in engineering, University of California, Berkeley. She was the first woman admitted to the School of Fine Arts in Paris. She applied 3 times, finally got admitted. And, and the fact that she was an architect and an engineer, I mean, it's even rare today. You don't see that kind of amazing work in one person. I mean, so honestly, a lot of the ranch legacy is the work of Julia Morgan, as you see with the built environment, with the Hearst Castle, the ranches down at San Simeon, and then at the Hacienda, which we'll get to. So she had over 800 buildings. Now, if you're up at the Hearst Castle, so imagine, it's late 1920s. He's building this castle. He's bought all this cattle ranching, and it's interesting because his father, started out as a farmer, became a miner, didn't really want to get into ranching, but he did buy some cattle, and it was really Hearst that just WR that started buying really full-fledged into cattle ranching. And if you see, like, way in the distance there, this is not a great photo, but I was standing there and I took that photo. It was snow-capped that day. Junipero Serra's in the back. So if you're standing at the pool at the castle, you're looking way back there, you kind of get an idea of that big landscape. But, it looks a lot closer than it is because it's a really far trek. But he's got cattle ranching operations up there. And he's got one of those land grants, the Milpitas, actually he's got all of them, but the Milpitas land grant, he's got a ranch house, which burns down in 1929. So the original Milpitas ranch house that he had people working at burns down. And this is a photo of the ruins after that. Now this barn is what the tin barn, the fire station at Fort Harnell Liggett, that's it. The one that was in the World's Fair in San Francisco, the 1915 World's Fair, and supposedly the trusses, the redwood trusses, were brought over by the James Brown Cattle Company, rebuilt into this. This building predates the Hacienda, which is going to end up being rebuilt right there. So he and Julia Morgan, this burns down, and there's a lot of good information at the Julia Morgan archives at Cal Poly. There's a lot of telegraphs and documents between Hearst and Julia Morgan, and they talked about where they're going to rebuild this building. I mean, she's in the middle of building the Hearst Castle, designing that, and they decide they're going to build it right there, rebuild this ranch house ruins. And so some of these telegraphs, I know it's going to be hard to see. So this is one, there's this beautiful little interaction where Julia Morgan is sick. She's incapacitated and is unable to take up a telegraph. She talked to her doctor. This is really fun. I found this at Cal Poly. So William Randolph Hearst writes and says, "Dear Miss Morgan, I think if you drank a bottle of English stout, or rather Irish stout, every day, it would do you a lot of good. Stop. You eat so little, the porter would give you strength. Stop. I send you some Dublin stout sincerely." So she writes back and says, "If you will send a very small allowance, I will faithfully try it." So this is the kind of interaction, that William Randolph Hearst and Julia Morgan had while they were building all this stuff. And it's kind of adorable. You also see at the Hearst Castle in their archives, all of these sketches that Julia Morgan did. And many of them have WR's initials or notes. I mean, I didn't realize how much he was into the detail. I mean, you think of him as this publishing magnate with all these businesses and, family in New York and all this stuff. And he was spending a lot of time on the details of architecture, of art, of the landscaping. They talked about what trees to plant. They would plant, and, the zoo at the castle. I mean, it's fascinating how much he was really into those details. So we've got these sketches. We tried to find sketches for the Hacienda at Fort Harnell Liggett. We couldn't find any, but we got a couple, that were just, these are all designs. Not all of them were built. Some of them were built down in San Simeon. So 1929, 1930, they start building the rebuilding the Milpitas Ranch House at Fort Harnell Liggett. And, you know, so they ended up, I think there was supposed to be a third wing that they never did end up building. But even things like, you know, they relocated oak trees and planted them around in planters. So this was built, so this is the Hacienda, 1929, 1930. It is listed on the National Register. It does have poured concrete and red tile roof, and it's Mission Revival style architecture. And what's really kind of cool about this is because he grew up, you know, basically in California. I know he spent, you know, time back and forth and in Europe, but you know, he and Julie Morgan were well aware of earthquakes and wildfires. And, you know, this is a very sustainable building, which is really cool to see built in 1930. It's poured concrete, it's super solid. You know, the red tile roofs, you know, as opposed to the wood ranch houses, you know, is better for prevention of, you know, damage during a wildfire. You know, and their writings, they talk about what they want to build, and they're looking at building something that's compatible with the Mission San Antonio right nearby. You know, so completely building on this Mission Revival style architecture, you know, just whatever it is, quarter mile up the road, which is just super cool. And it was a working cattle ranch. And I think you all have seen online, they call it the Hearst Hunting Lodge. Hearst did not allow hunting on his property. It was never a hunting lodge. I can't get that off the internet. Once it's out there, you're not getting it back. But and we know this from Ava Taylor's memoirs, and then also Frank Taylor, the son, who wrote. I've got an article about that, a slide about that later. But he didn't allow hunting on his ranch. He was an animal lover. I mean, Hearst had his zoo. So it was never. It was a working cattle ranch. There were cowboy rooms, and he did have occasional fiestas on the weekends with his friends. So what they would do, you know, what Ava Taylor writes about in her memoirs is they would be at the Hearst Castle, and they would ride up by horseback all the way up, and then have a barbecue fiesta. They were serving enchiladas or beans, like a kind of a typical Central Coast barbecue like we do today. And they would even have mariachi players and Spanish guitar players, you know, up in the dining room, up in the balcony up there, on the weekends. Hearst also built an airstrip out here, so he would fly out. So he could ride his horses out or fly back. Or they also had a taxi service that went out to the El Piojo Ranch. They could pick people up and drive them back out of San Luis Obispo. There's a taxi driver who wrote about you know, about those trips that he would make for Hearst. So that's a lot of, you know, so it was a working cattle ranch, but it was kind of, Hearst would use it on occasion. We don't think he ever slept there. You know, the lore is that Marion Davies would stay there. So there's a room that's called the Marion Davies Suite, at one of the tower rooms. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's kind of the lore there. He would also, Ava Taylor also talked about, he would stop at the San Miguelito Ranch House Hearst on his way up with his horses, which is another one of his ranching headquarters. So if you go back to the Mexican land grants, this is the Milpitas land grant where this house is, which is why it's called the Milpitas Ranch House. The first one burned down. This is rebuilt on top of it. So on the National Register, it's called the Milpitas Ranch House, related to that land grant. You had the San Miguelito land grant to the south, and you had a ranch house that was built, and I'll get into that later, but he would supposedly stop there, and Ava Taylor said he would actually overnight at the San Miguelito Ranch House and not here, which is, you know, which is interesting because this is, you know, would have been a nicer place than that, but that's what he preferred to do. He just liked being out there. We do not have the blueprints for the Hacienda, except for this, is at the Cal Poly archives, the Julie Morgan archives. So we've got blueprints of the shutters. So if anybody out there ever comes across any plans or elevations from Julie Morgan herself for the Hacienda, let us know. That's been a mystery since 1970s. We did just last month, we had, as a side note for what we're doing at Fort Harnell Liggett, the Center for Engineering and Research Lab at University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana with the Army Corps of Engineers. They've got a really strong architectural historian program, historical architects both. And they came out and they did 3D scanning of the Hacienda and of the Gil Adobe. And with that, we'll be able to get 3D scans and be able to do virtual recreations, you know, as well as prints, but it also helps tell us if there's structural damage or anything. But with that, we'll be able to reproduce, you know, pretty accurate plans and elevations, you know, since we don't really have the originals. But anyway, that's a side note. Let's see. Okay, Philip. So the interesting, so a lot of the beauty of the Hacienda is that architecture, you know, and the parapets and the trifoil windows. This is one of the few actual like artistic things that they put in the Hacienda, as opposed to the Hearst Castle, which is basically an art museum in and of itself. But this was tile from Mexico that, you know, they picked out, they really liked, put it in a random outdoor wall. So it's just, it's sweet, it's gorgeous, it's in a working cowboy ranch house. It's just pretty, it's pretty cool. So there's just some more photos. You know, the landscaping, the cactus, the oaks, they picked out themselves. This is the inside of the Hacienda. These are, Hearst had put a lot of his mother's Navajo blanket collection, Southwest Indian collections inside the ranch house alone, and the cowboys apparently were just putting them on the floor and drying off their boots on them. So that's, here's another, this is what the bar is today. This is, what is the bar today? This was in the 30s, the recreation room for the cowboys. So you can see there's a, you know, Southwest thing there, Southwest blanket there. There's a pool table back there. That fireplace is still there. You know, the Army went and put in the bar in the kitchen back here, did a modification on this side. We restored, we're back to these concrete floors. The Army had put carpeting at some point in the 50s or 60s. We removed that, but restored those floors. But this is what it looked like in the 30s. The Navajo blanket collection, Hearst ended up taking back. He asked Julian Morgan and the ranch manager to pack them up, and they're now at the LA, I think it's the LA County Museum of Natural History. And Anissa Baldwin, who's Hearst's great granddaughter, she's on the board there, and she came out to visit a few years ago and said that's where the Navajo blanket collection ended up going. So that'd be really cool to go see someday. This is actually Harry Taylor, not Hearst. Just another picture in the back. These cactus they planted, you know, design landscaping. You know, this is a working cattle ranch. Now this one you could see the mission's in ruins at that point in the 1930s. Lots of cattle. This is you can't really see this there, but this is about how it's not safe to let people handle the rugs and blankets who know nothing about them. Please remove them. And he was not happy about the the way his mother's blankets, but he put them in a working cattle ranch. He should have known better. Anyway, they took him out. So that's just another one of these fabulous series of telegraphs that are at the in San Luis Obispo at the Cal Poly Archives. This is a picture of one of those fiestas events that they would have in the weekends with the Spanish guitar player. Sitting in back of the Hacienda. This is a photo of the San Megaliter ranch house. So up there on the left, it's in ruins. This is what it looks like today, but this is where he would have stopped on the way. And I'll point it out on a map that I have later. You know, riding up by horseback, if you can. Okay, so here's the map. So we got San Simeon down there, Hearst Castle. So you'd come up Burnett Peak Road here, and then all the way up what turns into Salmon Creek Road on Fort Hunter Liggett, right up. And then that star is where the San Miguelito Ranch is. Whoops, we'll come back here. And then that's where the Hacienda is. So that kind of gives you a perspective of what was in, what that trip would have taken. I mean, it had to have taken all day, like most of the day. I can't imagine. This is Frank Taylor, wrote in the King City Rustler about the last cattle drive when Hearst sold the property. When he was selling it to the War Department, it talked about they were, the last cattle drive. It was a working cattle ranch. But I love the very end here. Whoops, sorry, I keep clicking forward. He just casually mentions how his father had caught the baseball player Ty Cobb illegally poaching on the property, out there hunting, and because Hearst didn't allow hunting, and so he says his father only interest in sports was prize fighting. He didn't listen to baseball at all, so his father didn't know who Ty Cobb was. And Ty Cobb's like, "Don't you recognize me? I'm Ty Cobb." And he says, "I don't care what kind of cobb you are, you can't hunt here." And later on, he's like, "Who the hell is Ty Cobb?" So yeah, he kicked Ty Cobb off. Did not allow hunting. All right. So we get to, so Hearst had it for 10 years, 1930 to 1940. 1940, the War Department, expecting, World War II is going to break out, starts buying up a bunch of land on the West Coast. They get about 75,000 acres of the lands, which, we're up to 162,000 more, but right now, but they start buying all these land. This is a photo that in 1941, that the War Department took of the landscape. And I just kind of looking out over the valley there, as they were scouting out what they were going to purchase. Here's another one. This is the Hacienda right there. Oh gosh, every time I point, that doesn't work. Okay, so this is the Hacienda there. This is Mission Road. If you go back here, one of these is Burnett Peak. So that's where the castle is, looking back that way. And if you notice, these are the Mission Aqueduct ditch system. If you see that going through there. But yeah, that's it. There's the Hacienda. There's not much else out there. It's an open landscape. World War II, 1940, Army comes in. They're still wearing their World War I uniforms because they hadn't, they were still producing World War II uniforms. They were too new. But I love this photo. So they're marching in front of the Mission. So it purchased in 1940 from Hearst. Now the legend is Hearst owned money on taxes, so he got a deal. I don't know if that's true or not. He was selling off other lands at that time. The War Department needed it. It made sense, So maybe you guys have more information on that, but I haven't seen anything more about that rumor or why. And we reported to Camp Roberts at the time, so we were just the training grounds for the headquarters at Camp Roberts. I like this one because, transforming the cattle ranch, here's the Army in. But what's interesting, and the reason why I bring this up is the Hacienda was the headquarters. So this is an enduring feature of the landscape. It's part of his legacy and Julian Morgan's legacy. The Army moved in and used it. There wasn't anything else there, and it's still the most solid building. We have the flags there. This is the headquarters in the 50s. This is what's now the bar, that recreation room we saw earlier. This is where the maps and the phones and the action was happening, when World War II broke out. Pretty cool. And then this is the chapel at the Mission. So the Mission was in ruins here. So these are services in 1941. And the reason I bring this up is because the Hearst Corporation, after they sold the property to the Army, this remained part of the Mission, the Catholic diocese, and the Hearst Corporation actually funded the restoration. So you see, this is in ruins, and this is a Hearst legacy right here, the reconstruction of the Mission San Antonio. This, I hope you guys can see this. Other things on the landscape, as part of the legacy is he built roads. Nacimiento Ferguson Road, Hearst had picked up. So hopefully you can see this. The arrow is following along. That's Nacimiento Ferguson Road right there. So this is an air photo from 1929. So I'll point out, so like look right there where the arrow is. I'm gonna go back. So there, it's just a trail, right? 1929. There's not much there at all. Here's 1939. So here again, Nacimiento Ferguson Road. You go in, and then oh, that's not good. But you can see there's, there's definitely more of, you can see the roads built. And he built roads. He built bridges. They built an airstrip. So here you can see the airstrip that Hearst used if he would fly out. This is the Hacienda. Again, this is the mission and the ditch system. And he'd put in the airstrip there. He also brought in telephone lines. I haven't seen anything that said he brought electricity out to the ranch. Pretty sure the Army brought the electricity out there, but the telephone lines, pretty sure that he had brought in. So just to kind of summarize or sort of wrap this up. So the legacy that I look at, the architecture. I mean, the Hearst Castle is phenomenal. Everyone knows it's a California landmark. It's a U.S. landmark in that sense. The buildings down at San Simeon, all of the ranch structures down below. You've got the Hacienda up at Fort Hunter Liggett. So historic architecture, up and down the valley. Reconstruction of the Mission San Antonio is part of that legacy. The infrastructure, the San Simeon Pier, roads and bridges, you put in telephone lines. There's an airstrip at San Simeon. The airstrip has been relocated at Fort Hunter Liggett, but he was the first one to get people flying in and out of there. And then I just want to talk a little about open space and undeveloped ranch lands. So you have this, oh, sorry, I did a cut and paste there. I apologize. You have this long-term pattern of large landholding agencies. So, you start with, it's Saline and Indian territory. You've got the missions coming in and blocking out these huge areas between the missions. You end up with Mexican land grants. It becomes part of Mexico. Again, you got these large landholding agencies. Turns over to some large cattle companies. Yeah, you do start to have the proliferation of smaller homesteads. And when you have the gold rush in California, you got the town of Jalón pops up. A lot of activity and people moving into California at a massive rate. But this landscape tends to stay pretty undeveloped. And when Hearst comes in and starts massively buying up all this land, much to the chagrin, I think, of a lot of the local landowners at the time, you still end up with this legacy of undeveloped open space land. And then when War Department and the Forest Service come in, and are purchasing land, you still end up with these large open space, open ranch lands, which is, I think is pretty cool. And I know that in the 60s, after Hearst had died, there was talk the Hearst Corporation was going to develop, they actually planned cities. And I think some of you may have more information about this, like massive subdivisions, actual planned cities, that they were going to just divide up this landscape. And it was Steve Hearst, I believe, and the family that came in and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to keep ranching and keep this landscape as it is. So a lot of, I think, what the legacy is not just the awesome architecture and the infrastructure and the roads and stuff, but it's also the legacy of what didn't get built. That it's still kind of this open land. He could have sold it. He didn't have to sell it to the War Department. He could have sold off into all kinds of small pieces, maybe, and made more money. I don't know. But I think I see that as just part of this ongoing legacy of this really cool open rangeland, where we live. And then the last point is the zebras. Of course, you can't not talk about the Hearst ranching legacy and not say the zebras. So that's it. Happy to hear your questions, comments, and all your corrections for anything that I misspoke.